The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in Los Angeles was packed with celebrities, journalists, and political figures. The annual Hollywood Legacy Awards was supposed to be a night of celebration, a tribute to the icons who had shaped the entertainment industry. But tonight, it was about to become a battleground. Among the honorees sat Clint Eastwood, a living legend, his chiseled face set in an unreadable expression. At 94, he was still as sharp as ever, but years of Hollywood's leftward shift had left him a controversial figure. His films, his values, his very presence in the industry had become a thorn in the side of those who pushed the progressive agenda. And tonight, it seemed like someone had decided that this was the moment to take him down. On stage, Ethan Reynolds, a well-known liberal journalist, adjusted his tie and smirked as he stepped up to the podium. He was the type of reporter who thrived on controversy, who built his career by attacking conservative figures under the guise of tough journalism. And now, his sights were set on Clint Eastwood. "Mr. Eastwood," Ethan began, his voice dripping with condescension, "your career spans over 6 decades. You've played the rugged cowboy, the no-nonsense detective, the symbol of old-school masculinity. But let's be honest, do you think there's still a place for someone like you in today's Hollywood? I mean, let's face it, times have changed. Your movies promote outdated ideals, and many would argue that your influence belongs to a bygone era. Shouldn't you just fade into the past?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Some of the younger Hollywood elite smirked, waiting for the old man to stumble over his response. Others, those who had grown up watching Eastwood's films, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Clint Eastwood simply narrowed his eyes, took a slow sip from the glass of whiskey in front of him, and leaned into the microphone. "You know, kid," he said, his voice calm but razor-sharp, "I remember when reporters used to ask real questions, not just ones designed to get them retweets." Laughter and scattered applause broke out, but Ethan wasn't done. He was here to make a point. "But Mr. Eastwood," he pressed on, "you've openly criticized modern Hollywood. You've mocked the so-called woke culture. You still insist on portraying masculinity in a way that many now find problematic. Aren't you just holding on to an outdated fantasy? Isn't it time to step aside and let the new generation take over?" The energy in the room shifted. Some people nodded. Others sat still, sensing the tension rising. Ethan wasn't just interviewing Clint Eastwood, he was attacking him. And that's when a voice rang out from the audience. "Excuse me." Heads turned. A few gasps rippled through the room as Barron Trump stood up from his seat. At 18, he was already taller than most men in the room, his posture composed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't supposed to be part of this event, he was just a guest, accompanying his mother, Melania, who had been seated a few rows behind Clint. But now he was walking toward the stage, and he wasn't smiling. The cameras turned toward him, capturing every second as he stepped onto the platform, stopping just a few feet away from Ethan Reynolds. The liberal journalist's smirk faltered for the first time. He hadn't expected to be challenged, let alone by Barron Trump. Barron turned toward Clint Eastwood, giving him a respectful nod before shifting his gaze to Ethan. His voice, deep and measured, cut through the silence. "You want to talk about outdated ideals?" he asked, his tone calm but sharp. "Maybe the real problem isn't Mr. Eastwood. Maybe the real problem is people like you, people who think that respect, strength, and integrity are things of the past." The tension was electric. Some people in the audience nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable. But Barron wasn't backing down. "You claim to support diversity of thought, but the moment someone challenges your views, you try to silence them. You claim to respect the past, but only the parts that fit your narrative. And now you want a man like Clint Eastwood to fade into the past? Well, I've got news for you. People like him don't fade. Legends don't fade." The silence was shattered by a single sound clapping. Slow, deliberate. It came from none other than Clint Eastwood himself. He looked up at Barron with a rare flicker of amusement in his eyes. Then he lifted his whiskey glass and nodded. "Kid's got a point," he said simply. And just like that, the room erupted. Some guests burst into applause, others murmured in shock, and Ethan Reynolds stood frozen, his carefully planned takedown completely derailed. But Barron wasn't done yet. He turned back to Ethan, looking him dead in the eye. "Do you have anything else to say?" The reporter opened his mouth, but for the first time in his career, he had no words. For the first time in his career, Ethan Reynolds was at a loss for words. His smirk had vanished, replaced by an awkward tightness around his jaw. The cameras were locked on him, capturing every second of his humiliation. But this was live television, and Ethan knew he couldn't afford to look weak. He took a breath, forcing a chuckle, as if he was still in control. "Well, Mr. Trump," he said, feigning amusement, "I see that you've inherited your father's combative nature. But let's be real. Are you really in a position to talk about Hollywood? About the industry? About anything at all? You're just an 18-year-old kid who's lived his life in a golden tower. What do you actually know about the real world?" The insult was met with a mix of gasps and murmurs. He had just tried to belittle Barron Trump on national television. Barron, however, didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, his blue eyes locked onto Ethan like a hawk assessing its prey. And then he stepped closer. The tension in the ballroom was suffocating. "You want to talk about the real world?" Barron said, his voice quieter now, but somehow more dangerous. "Tell me something, Mr. Reynolds. What do you actually know about real strength? About real values? You sit here, wearing your expensive suit, working for a multi-billion-dollar media empire that only allows one kind of opinion to exist. And yet, you act like you're the voice of the people?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "You ridicule Clint Eastwood, a man who worked his way up from nothing, who built a legacy through hard work, discipline, and grit. You mock men like my father, men who fought for their vision, despite relentless attacks from people like you. But let's be real here, Mr. Reynolds. When was the last time you actually stood for something that wasn't approved by your bosses?" Silence. The audience was hanging on every word. Barron let the pause linger, then leaned in just slightly, his voice barely above a whisper, just loud enough for the cameras to catch. "You call me privileged, but the truth is, you're the one who's afraid." Ethan's face twitched. He tried to recover, forcing another smirk. "Afraid? Of what? Of you?" Barron shook his head slowly. "No, of the truth. Of people like Mr. Eastwood, like my father, like me. Because deep down, you know that no matter how much you try to silence us, no matter how many headlines you write, how many hit pieces you publish." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We're still here. And we're not going anywhere." The audience was dead silent, and then a single clap. Then another, and suddenly a wave of applause. It started from Clint Eastwood's table. The Hollywood icon leaned back in his chair, that familiar half-smirk on his face, nodding in approval as he tapped his hands together. Others followed. First Melania Trump, then a few conservative actors. Then producers, executives, even a few of the younger Hollywood elite. The room erupted. Standing ovation. Even those who had initially sided with Ethan could feel it. The shift in energy, the sheer momentum behind Barron's words. It was a moment that couldn't be ignored. Ethan, however, was fuming. His carefully planned attack had backfired spectacularly. His career was built on taking down conservatives, on making them look outdated, irrelevant, defeated. But this was a disaster. His earpiece crackled. His producer was yelling, "Take control of the situation." Desperate, Ethan grabbed the microphone. All right, let's settle down." But suddenly, boom! A loud thud echoed through the ballroom. People turned toward the back of the room. A group of activists had just stormed in. Cameras whipped around as a handful of people dressed in all black, holding signs that read, "Hollywood must change." And no room for toxic icons marched toward the stage. One of them grabbed a microphone from a nearby stand and started shouting, "This is exactly what's wrong with this industry." The leader, a young woman with a buzz cut and furious eyes, screamed into the mic. Clint Eastwood represents the OLD, racist, toxic Hollywood, and now we have another Trump defending him? No, we will not let this industry be overrun by bigotry again. More shouts. The activists raised their fists. Some guests stood in shock, others looked downright amused. Clint Eastwood? He just rolled his eyes and took another sip of his whiskey. But Barron, he just smirked, and then he took the microphone again. The room braced itself. What was he about to say? The tension in the room exploded as the activists stormed in, their voices echoing through the grand ballroom. Dressed in all black, they held up signs that read, "Hollywood must change," and no more toxic icons. Their leader, a young woman with a buzz cut and a fierce glare, grabbed a microphone from a nearby stand and started shouting, "This is exactly what's wrong with this industry." She screamed, her voice filled with rage. Clint Eastwood represents the OD, racist, toxic Hollywood. And now we have another Trump defending him? No. We will not let this industry be overrun by bigotry again. Some guests gasped, others murmured in shock. A few of the younger Hollywood elite nodded in agreement. The cameras turned to capture every moment, and Ethan Reynolds, the liberal journalist who had just been humiliated by Barron Trump, saw his opportunity. Smirking, Ethan leaned into the microphone. "Well, it looks like I'm not the only one who thinks this industry needs a change," he said, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Maybe Mr. Trump should listen to what these passionate young voices have to say." Barron didn't even blink. Slowly, he turned to face the activists. He studied them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The camera zoomed in, capturing every detail of his reaction. Then, he smirked. "Passionate young voices?" he repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "That's a nice way of saying an angry mob trying to silence people they don't agree with." The buzzcut activist's eyes flashed with fury. "You don't get it, do you?" She spat. "People like you, like him, have had control for too long. This is our time now. We're here to take back the industry from outdated, privileged, toxic figures like Clint Eastwood." Barron took a slow step forward. The crowd held its breath. "Let me guess," he said coolly. "You want to dismantle the system, tear down the past, burn it all down and start over?" The activist nodded aggressively. "Exactly. The old Hollywood is dead, and we're here to bury it." Barron exhaled, shaking his head with a smirk. "Wow, you're not even hiding it anymore." The activist narrowed her eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" Barron turned, addressing the entire room. His voice boomed through the speakers. "They don't want equality. They want control. They don't want respect. They want submission. And if you don't give them what they want, they'll try to erase you." The activists erupted in anger. "Lies!" someone shouted. "Misinformation!" another screamed. Barron didn't flinch. He was in complete control. The ballroom was now a battlefield, and the war had just begun. The room was a powder keg ready to explode. The activists were screaming over each other, their faces twisted with rage. Some guests sat frozen in shock, others looked uncomfortable, unsure of how to react. The Hollywood elites, the liberal media figures, they were watching carefully. Would the tide turn? Would Barron Trump finally crack under the pressure? But Barron? He was unshaken. He stood tall, his expression calm, as the leader of the activists. The buzzcut woman with fire in her eyes stormed toward him. "You don't get to sit there and lecture us about fairness," she shouted, gripping the microphone so tightly her knuckles turned white. "People like Clint Eastwood, like your father, they built this corrupt industry. And now you want to act like you're the victims?" Barron tilted his head slightly. "Corrupt industry? Funny, because last time I checked, Hollywood still makes billions of dollars off people like Clint Eastwood, off strong male leads, off action, off tradition. But sure, keep pretending you're the underdogs. The activists' nostrils flared. That's because the system is still in place. We're here to tear it down. And then it happened. One of the activists, a masked figure in the back, grabbed a wine glass from a table and hurled it at Barron. Gasps rang through the room. The glass shattered just inches from his feet. A female guest let out a scream. Security moved in immediately, but Barron lifted a hand, stopping them. He turned back to the activists, his face like stone. "That's it, isn't it?" he said, his voice sharper now. "You talk about peace, but the moment someone doesn't bow to you, you turn violent. This isn't about justice. This isn't about progress. This is about power. And you don't want to share it, you want to control it." The energy in the room shifted. For the first time, even some of the Hollywood elites, people who had remained silent, watching from the sidelines, started murmuring in agreement. The activists realized they were losing ground. "Shut him up." One of them yelled, "He's just spreading more Trump propaganda." Barron chuckled. "You see that?" he said, looking around. "That's the only argument they have, not logic, not facts. Just shut him up, because they can't win with reason, so they turn to force." The activist leader was losing it. She turned to the audience, desperate now. "You're not seriously going to let this privileged little boy stand here and lecture US, are you?" she shouted. For a moment, it seemed like she might turn things around. A few younger, left-leaning guests nodded along. Maybe, just maybe, she could take back control of the room. Then Clint Eastwood spoke. "All right, kid." His deep, gravelly voice cut through the chaos like a bullet. The entire room went silent. Every head turned toward the Hollywood legend himself. Clint Eastwood leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He stared at the activist leader for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he spoke again. "You remind me of a lot of people I've seen over the years," he said, his voice low and calm. "The kind that scream the loudest, throw the biggest tantrums, demand the most attention. But you know what I've learned after all these years?" The activist glared at him, arms crossed. "Oh yeah? What?" Clint picked up his whiskey glass and took a slow sip before answering. "The loudest ones? The angriest ones. They're always the ones who end up forgotten the fastest." Boom! The crowd erupted. A roaring wave of applause crashed over the ballroom. People rose to their feet. Even some of the Hollywood elites, ones who had been too scared to take a side, started clapping. The activists? They were finished. The leader's face twisted with rage. She turned back to Barron, pointing a shaky finger. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You think you've won?" Barron smirked. "No." He stepped forward, looking her dead in the eye. "I know I have." The activist screamed in frustration, grabbing one of her signs and ripping it in half before storming out. One by one, the other activists followed. The war was over. And Barron Trump? He had just cemented himself as the next generation's conservative icon. But the night wasn't over yet, because as the activists disappeared, Ethan Reynolds, the liberal journalist, stood up again. He grabbed his microphone, his face red with humiliation. Well, he said, trying to regain control. "That was quite the performance, Barron. But let's not forget words are just words. Let's see if you can actually back them up." The tension spiked again. Was this really not over yet? Barron slowly turned back toward him, tilting his head. Was this guy really dumb enough to challenge him again? The cameras zoomed in. Millions would be watching this live. The battle wasn't finished yet. Because now it was personal. The ballroom was still buzzing with energy. The activists were gone, their attempted takeover shut down in spectacular fashion. Clint Eastwood's words had sealed their fate, and Barron Trump had delivered a performance that would be watched, shared, and debated for weeks. But now the real fight was about to begin. Because Ethan Reynolds wasn't done yet. The liberal journalist straightened his tie, his face still red from humiliation. He refused to let a teenager a Trump, no less, outmaneuver him on live television. This was his moment to salvage what was left of his reputation. He leaned forward, gripping the microphone tightly. "All right, Barron," he said, forcing a smug grin. "You're good with words, I'll give you that. But let's be real, talk is cheap. Do you actually stand for anything? Or are you just another spoiled rich kid playing conservative because it's trendy in your family?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Barron raised an eyebrow. The cameras zoomed in on his face. Millions were watching. Then, slowly, he smiled. "You're really desperate, aren't you?" he said, his voice low but steady. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." Barron tilted his head. "You lost control of the room, you lost the crowd, and now you're trying to make this about me instead of your failure. Classic deflection. I expected better from a so-called top journalist." Scattered laughter broke out in the audience. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm just asking a question." Barron nodded. "Right. You want to know if I actually stand for anything? Fine. Let me make it very clear." The room fell silent. Barron turned to face the audience. This was his moment. "I stand for respect. I stand for tradition. I stand for honoring the people who built this country instead of tearing them down. I stand for free speech, for debate, for actual diversity of thought, not the fake kind Hollywood pretends to care about." The crowd erupted in applause. Barron turned back to Ethan. "And what do you stand for, Mr. Reynolds?" Ethan's face twitched. Do you stand for fairness?" Barron pressed, stepping closer. "Or do you stand for censorship?" Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Barron's eyes pierced through him. "Do you stand for truth? Or just whatever your bosses tell you to push?" Ethan's face was now bright red. He looked trapped. Barron leaned in just slightly, voice calm but devastatingly sharp. "Do you stand for journalism? Or for propaganda?" Silence. The room held its breath. Ethan was finished. His reputation shattered, his credibility gone. He had no comeback. And Barron knew it. He stepped back, flashed one last smirk, and handed the microphone back. "Thanks for playing," he said. Boom! The crowd exploded. Standing ovation. Cheers. Even some of the Hollywood elites couldn't deny what had just happened. Barron Trump had dominated the debate, exposed Ethan Reynolds, and left the liberal journalist speechless on live television. This moment would go viral. And Ethan? He could only sit there, staring at the microphone in his hands, knowing that his career would never be the same again. Barron Trump just put that reporter in his place. But what do you think? Did he go too far, or was this exactly what needed to be said? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this video, do not leave just yet. Take a second to hit the like button and subscribe. Subscribing is completely free, and it helps us bring you more powerful stories like this one. And do not forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We truly appreciate your support, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.